The Watcher in the Shadows. Christmas Eve 4 years ago was supposed to be like any other holiday night for the Hall family. The festive dinner at the restaurant had left them full and content. But as the night grew colder, something far more chilling began to unfold. For Emily Hall, the eldest daughter, that night became the cornerstone of a nightmare that never truly ended. It began innocuously. The Hall family, Thomas, the jovial patriarch, Susan, his kind-hearted wife, and their 3 children, Emily, Jake, and Mia, piled into their modest family car after the celebration. Snow fell in soft waves, blanketing the roads and muffling the world in a tranquil hush. Emily, at 17, was the only one still wide awake, scrolling through her phone as her parents and siblings dozed off in their seats. When Thomas announced he needed to stop at a gas station to grab a pack of cigarettes, Emily shrugged and stayed in the car, immersed in her game. The station was isolated, its single flickering light casting long shadows on the pristine snow. Minutes passed. Emily's attention drifted from her phone to the eerie quiet outside. She glanced up and saw him, a man standing near the edge of the station's light, half shrouded in darkness. He was tall, unnaturally still, with a blank expression that sent a shiver down her spine. His shadow didn't behave like it should. Instead of stretching behind him, it seemed to dissolve into the surrounding darkness, as though the night itself was swallowing him whole. She turned away, heart pounding, and pretended not to notice. By the time her family returned to the car, the man was gone. Emily hesitated to mention him, dismissing the encounter as a trick of her imagination. The ride home was uneventful, yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, certain she would see the man following them. But the snow-covered roads were empty. When they arrived home, the warmth of their house should have brought comfort, but Emily's unease only deepened. As she prepared for bed, she cast one last glance out of her bedroom window. Her breath hitched. There he was. The man from the gas station stood beneath the towering oak tree in their front yard, his face tilted upward, staring directly at her window. Emily's scream brought her father running. By the time Thomas grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the man had vanished, leaving no trace but the deep footprints etched into the snow. That night, Emily lay awake, every creak of the house amplifying her terror. Around 3 in the morning, a sound broke the fragile silence, a soft, deliberate tapping on her window. Her heart stopped as she turned her head. The man's face was pressed against the glass. His lips twisted into a grotesque smile. His eyes, dark and lifeless, bore into hers. Emily's scream woke the entire house. Thomas called the police while Susan tried to calm her daughter. By the time the authorities arrived, the man had disappeared once again, leaving only a fresh trail of footprints that ended abruptly in the middle of the yard, as though he'd been plucked from the earth. The following days were a blur of fear and paranoia. The family installed security cameras and reinforced the doors and windows. But it did little to ease Emily's mind. She felt the man's presence everywhere, in the shadows of her room, in the reflection of her mirror, even in her dreams. Always watching, always waiting. Weeks turned into months, and life began to return to normal, at least on the surface. Emily buried herself in schoolwork and hobbies, trying to forget. But the memories lingered, a constant weight on her chest. 4 years later, on Christmas Eve, the Hall family decided to revisit the restaurant where the nightmare began. Emily, now 21, hesitated but eventually agreed. She told herself she was being irrational. The man was just a drifter or a figment of her imagination. The dinner was pleasant, filled with laughter and nostalgia. As they drove home, snow fell once more, painting the roads in a familiar white. Emily stared out the window, her reflection blending with the passing trees. She almost convinced herself it had all been a bad dream. But when they passed the same gas station, her blood ran cold. He was there. The man stood in the exact same spot. Under the flickering light. His blank stare followed their car as they drove past. Emily's breath quickened, but this time, she said nothing. She didn't want to alarm her family. She didn't want them to think she was still haunted by something that should have been left in the past. That night, Emily's old fears returned with a vengeance. She locked her bedroom door and closed her curtains, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was near. The hours crawled by, and just as she began to drift off, the tapping started again. It was louder this time, more insistent. Emily's stomach churned as she forced herself to look. The curtains were drawn, but she could see his silhouette pressed against them. His head cocked at an unnatural angle. He tapped rhythmically, like a metronome, as though taunting her to open the window. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number lit up the screen. "Why don't you let me in?" Emily's hand trembled as she showed the message to her father. Thomas, armed with a baseball bat, stormed outside, determined to confront the intruder once and for all. But when he opened the door, there was nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. Over the following days, the texts continued. Short, cryptic messages that sent shivers down Emily's spine. "I see you. You can't hide forever. We'll be together soon." The police traced the number, but it led to a dead end. No name, no address. Nothing. It was as if the sender didn't exist. On New Year's Eve, Emily woke to find a package on her windowsill. Inside was a single photograph. It showed her sleeping in her bed. Taken from inside the room. Her breath caught as she realized something horrifying. The man wasn't just outside. He'd been inside the house. From that moment on, Emily's life became a waking nightmare. No matter where she went, she felt his presence. She moved to a new city, changed her number, and even deleted her social media accounts. But the texts resumed within days. "You can't escape." The final message came a year later, on Christmas Eve. "Look behind you." Emily's scream echoed through the silent house. By the time her family reached her room, it was empty. The only trace of her was a set of footprints leading from her bed to the window, and the faint, rhythmic tapping that continued long after she was gone. Story 2. The small, snow-covered town of Willow Creek seemed peaceful enough on a cold December evening. The streets were quiet, the houses adorned with twinkling lights and wreaths. Mary Grant, a freelance writer, had just returned from her friend's Christmas party. She'd left early, feeling the urge to relax in her cozy home with a hot cup of cocoa and her favorite blanket. As Mary parked her car in her driveway, she noticed something unusual. Across the street, partially hidden in the shadows, was an old, beat-up station wagon. Its windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who, if anyone, was inside. The vehicle was unfamiliar, and something about its presence sent a chill down her spine. Dismissing her unease as paranoia, Mary grabbed her things and hurried into her house, locking the door behind her. She kicked off her shoes, turned on the Christmas lights in her living room, and settled on the couch. A holiday movie played softly in the background as she scrolled through her phone. But the tranquility didn't last long. A sharp knock echoed through the house, startling her. Mary froze, her heart pounding. She glanced at the clock. It was 10:47 p.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? Cautiously, she approached the door and peeked through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, wearing a thick coat and a beanie. His face was shadowed, but she could see his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Yes?" Mary called out, keeping the door firmly closed. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice muffled. "I'm looking for someone." Have you seen a gray station wagon parked around here? Mary hesitated. She remembered the car but felt uneasy about sharing any information. No. I haven't. Sorry. The man shifted on his feet, his hands buried in his pockets. Are you sure? It's really important. I'm sure. Good night. She stepped back and locked the deadbolt for extra security. For a moment, she stood by the door, listening. The man lingered outside, muttering something she couldn't make out. Then, after what felt like an eternity, his footsteps retreated. She exhaled in relief but couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. An hour passed. And Mary tried to immerse herself in her movie. But the peaceful atmosphere had been shattered. She kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone staring back at her. Then, just as she began to relax, the power flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped the house. Mary grabbed her phone, using its flashlight to navigate. Her heartbeat quickened as she searched for the emergency candles she kept in the kitchen. As she lit one, a faint noise caught her attention, a soft scraping sound coming from the backyard. Her stomach tightened. Slowly, she crept to the back window and peeked out. At first, she saw nothing. The yard was still, the snow reflecting the pale moonlight. But then, movement near the shed caught her eye. A shadowy figure was standing by the door, their back turned to her. Mary's breath hitched. She backed away from the window and grabbed her phone to call the police. As she explained the situation, the operator assured her that officers were on their way. Mary's eyes darted toward the kitchen, where she had left a knife earlier while preparing dinner. She grabbed it, her hands trembling. Minutes felt like hours as she waited. The sound of crunching snow reached her ears. It was closer now. Suddenly, a loud bang erupted from the front door, followed by a man's voice shouting, "Open up. We need to talk." Mary's blood ran cold. It was the same man from earlier. She stayed silent, gripping the knife tightly. The banging continued, more frantic this time, until it abruptly stopped. Silence filled the air, but she knew he hadn't left. The sound of glass shattering from the back of the house made her jump. She turned to see a hand reaching through the broken kitchen window, trying to unlock it. Without thinking, she rushed forward and slashed at the intruding hand. The man let out a cry of pain and pulled back. Blood dripped onto the windowsill. The sound of sirens in the distance was a lifeline. Mary ran to the front door and opened it just as the police arrived. The officers swept through the property but found no trace of the man. The station wagon was gone as well. However, when they checked the shed, they discovered something chilling, a makeshift shrine with photographs of Mary, taken without her knowledge. And a note scrawled in red ink, "You can't hide forever." Shaken, Mary spent the night at a friend's house. The next morning, she returned home to assess the damage. Everything seemed normal until she entered her bedroom. There, sitting on her bed, was an old, worn-out doll she'd never seen before. Its porcelain face was cracked. And its dress was smeared with dirt. Clutched in its tiny hand was a knife, identical to the one she had used the night before. Mary's scream echoed through the house. But no one was there to hear it. As she Story 3: The Enigma of the Forest Shadows. It was a frigid December evening when Clara and I found ourselves navigating through a desolate forest road. The only route back home from a secluded cabin party. The festivities had run late, and the warmth of laughter and Christmas carols had made way for the eerie silence of the woods. The road, flanked by towering trees, seemed endless, with shadows cast by the dim moonlight creating shifting shapes on the asphalt. Halfway through the journey, Clara gasped and clutched my arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I hadn't, but her unease was contagious. What? I asked, slowing the car. What did you see? Someone ran across the road. She stammered. I pulled over, peering into the darkness. The headlights illuminated a narrow stretch of road ahead, but nothing else. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the better of me. Stay in the car, I instructed, stepping out into the biting cold. The silence was oppressive. My boots crunched on the frosty ground as I scanned the area. Just as I was about to give up and return to the car, Clara honked the horn. Startled, I turned to see her pointing frantically through the windshield. Following her gaze, my heart froze. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, gaunt, and unnervingly still. The person was naked, their body smeared with dirt and grime, and in their hand was a long, jagged shard of metal. The figure's head tilted unnaturally as they locked eyes with me. Suddenly, the figure smiled, a grotesque twist of lips revealing yellowed teeth. Without warning, they began to sprint toward me. I bolted back to the car, my hands fumbling to unlock the door. Clara screamed as the figure closed the gap. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and floored the gas pedal. The car roared to life, skidding briefly before gaining traction. Through the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the road. Their eyes burning with an intensity that seemed inhuman. The drive home was silent, the tension between Clara and me palpable. We both knew what we'd seen wasn't normal. But neither of us wanted to voice our fears. When we finally reached my house, I double-checked every lock and closed every curtain. Yet, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the house felt amplified. Every shadow a potential threat. The next morning, as sunlight spilled into the room, I began to rationalize the encounter. It was probably just a drifter, I told Clara. She didn't respond but handed me a cup of coffee. Her expression was troubled. You should check the car, she finally said. Dreading what I might find, I stepped outside. My breath caught when I saw it, a streaky handprint on the passenger side window. The smudged outline was unmistakably human but too large to belong to Clara or me. Worse, it was fresh. A week passed. But the incident clung to us like a shadow. Clara refused to talk about it, and I found myself obsessively researching the area. The forest was known for its share of urban legends, missing hikers, strange lights, even a supposed cult that had operated there decades ago. Most stories were vague, but one detail recurred, a derelict cabin deep in the woods. Long abandoned but shrouded in sinister rumors. I decided to return. Clara protested, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed answers. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a vague sense of direction, I ventured back to the forest, this time in daylight. The cabin was easy to miss, hidden by overgrowth and half-collapsed under the weight of time. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with mildew, and the floor was littered with debris. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, crude and erratic, as if etched by an unsteady hand. In the center of the room was a makeshift altar, cobbled together from broken furniture. On it lay a photograph. My blood ran cold. The photograph was of me and Clara, taken at the party just a week prior. Scribbled across it in jagged handwriting were the words, "You're next." I stumbled out of the cabin, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I turned to leave, I noticed footprints in the dirt, bare, human footprints leading away from the cabin and into the deeper woods. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The trail led to a clearing where the trees seemed unnaturally sparse. In the center was a pit, its edges lined with jagged rocks. Inside, something glinted in the sunlight. I approached cautiously, peering down. The pit was filled with shards of glass, rusted metal, and bones. Human bones. The stench was overwhelming, and I stumbled back, my stomach churning. A sudden crack of a branch snapped me out of my horror. Whipping around, I saw him again, the man from the road. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me. But this time, he wasn't alone. Shadowy figures began emerging from the tree line, all naked, all smeared in dirt, all holding makeshift weapons. Their movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, as they closed in. I ran. My lungs burning as I crashed through the undergrowth. The sounds of pursuit were deafening, branches snapping, guttural growls, and the pounding of bare feet on the forest floor. Somehow, I made it back to my car, throwing myself inside and speeding away. My hands were trembling so badly that I nearly veered off the road. When I reached home, Clara was waiting, her face pale. Before I could explain, she held up her phone. On the screen was a photo of the two of us asleep in bed. The photo had been taken from inside the house. We left that night, abandoning the house and everything in it. We moved to a new city, changed our numbers, and tried to rebuild our lives. For a while, it seemed to work. But the shadows never truly left us. A year later, Clara disappeared. I came home to find the door ajar and the house empty. No signs of struggle, no note, just, gone. On the dining table was a single object, a photograph of Clara and me from the cabin party, with the words, "We're not done yet." Now, I live in constant fear. Every shadow, every creak, every misplaced item fills me with dread. I don't know who they are or what they want. But I know this, they're watching. And they'll come for me soon.